Hey guys, welcome back to Results Junkies podcast. After a brief bit of technical difficulties, Paul and I are here for your viewing pleasure. We did have some memes from Alex Adams, who sent me some really fun ones, but having a little bit of a technical glitch between me and Paul, all the bits and packets moving back and forth, so we'll try those for next week. I promise that we will try and get those in. But
I can see how much this pains you, by the way, that you cannot.
I want to find another way. I have to find another way to ridicule you today. Yeah. We had a great article about Klarna back in the news again. Not afraid of big moves. Also, an article from Axios that you sent my way about a first for me, which would be a 100-page article that I read that was published in NYU's Journal of Legislation and Public Policy. And I can tell you that I did not read all 100 pages, but I did read a fair amount, and there's a lot to digest there. If we get time after all that, I've got a pretty straightforward, simple question for you just to get your thoughts on something related to Apple and the iPhone world. But if you're just joining us, housekeeping notes, show at resultsjunkies.com is the best way to get a hold of us. On social media, he is at Paul Singh on all those social media channels. I am at Pizza in Motion. Best way to help us out growing the show is if you're watching, hit the like button for the episode and make sure you subscribe to the Results Junkies podcast feed. If you're listening to us from whatever channel you're on, leave us a review and a rating, and also subscribe to the show. All right, so let's dig into Klarna, man. We just talked about Klarna last week. We talked about the fact that they were going to cut staffing. Ultimately, headcount was going to be cut by more than 50%. And this was through a number of different tools, including some generative AI stuff. And then you sent this tweet, which was pretty surprising. I'll read just a bit of it and then have you dig in here. Klarna's CEO, Sebastian Siemiatkowski, I hope I pronounced that right, said the company is shutting down its SaaS provider Salesforce, and within a few days will shut down Workday. I think most people know what Salesforce is. If you don't know what Workday is, it's a combination onboarding, streamlining, HR, and office systems solution, popular with a lot of newer companies. And so two pretty big systems that Klarna has said that they're shutting down. Curious to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, I think that the steady pace of information that's coming out of Klarna, their PR and comms teams are just working overdrive here, because it's like, I feel like layoffs were recent, and then than now they're saying like they're going to squash a bunch of the software providers. Somewhere in there they're saying, hey, our workforce is going to further decrease, but hey, by the way, it's not a layoff. We're just not backfilling the roles. So it's a pretty big bet. Now, these guys are privately held,
Sure.
So really they don't have to appease anybody but their own investors. But these are some pretty bold moves that I think, public companies would be scared to make these moves as aggressively as these guys have. So I think let's see how to say this. The bear case, there's a bull case here and a bear case, or maybe an optimistic case and a pessimistic case. Is the pessimistic side is like, we are now watching in real time what, generative AI can do to existing workforces and vendor relationships and things like that. The optimistic viewpoint is the same thing, actually, that we're seeing what generative AI can do to, companies' cost centers throughout the business. So it's probably not articulated very well, but this is like, what he's talking about publicly is what I've noticed a lot of founders and execs are asking privately, but nobody really wants to be the first guinea pig to bet things on AI. And we'll touch more about that on that NYU article that we're going to talk about, because there are some risks here. And that's the underlying thing that makes this so interesting, is that he's taking some big strategic bets here, particularly where, the risk or the liability is not well defined just yet. But yeah, I thought this was very, very interesting.
Yeah, I'll say I've heard of a number of products that are out there to try and take on, some of these companies like Salesforce and Workday. I'd say it's harder to replace Salesforce than Workday, in my opinion, just because I think Salesforce, is very ubiquitous. So if you have a front-end sales team or an inside sales team, those folks are likely used to that product. And then also, I think Salesforce did a really good job integrating with other key systems for sales metrics and stuff like that. But I still think there are ways to get around it. I just think it's harder. Workday does contain a lot of blocking and tackling information, but and I know it's not quite this simple, but I akin it more to switching payroll companies than switching your entire Salesforce's, back end out. And so I think there are a lot of people trying to upend the way that stuff happens. There are a number of companies in the restaurant industry that a bunch of us are right now. So, we use a product called WorkStream. There's another product out there, I think called Paradox, a number of fellow franchisees are using that we're looking into as well. And it's just sort of like taking it, for lack of a better term, from cradle to grave, from the moment the applicant hits us to the moment that they're no longer with us. But I think, ultimately, as you well know, SaaS subscriptions, are the lifeblood of so many, of our portfolio companies. They make money by selling SaaS. They make money by adding licenses on a yearly basis. And you and I have talked about, how those licenses creeped up at a certain point, and then during COVID, when headcount reduced, that license count went down. But the next move seems to be, I think, in two different veins. First off, in competing products that result in significant cost savings per seat. And then also, too, sort of, I wouldn't say reversion to the mean, that's probably not the right way to say it, but there's some products out there now where you can go back to the olden days where instead of buying SaaS, you can buy a product and then you can choose to buy updates. You're typically responsible for the hosting, so there might be a little bit more responsibility, but definitely a bit of a reversion to the old model where you and I used to show up to our local Best Buy or Office Depot, buy the latest version of software because we needed the newest features, newest tax codes, whatever, loaded into it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we're still probably in the first inning of AI being used this way, but it's just the thing that's notable about this particular one, at least to me, is that, I think sometimes when we think about new technologies, I mean, I guess here's the way I was thinking about this earlier, is that if we were to time travel back to visit ourselves in something like 1999, if I had said to you at that point, hey, listen, man, that Nokia phone in your pocket, listen, in about 7 or 8 years, you're going to have a mini computer. It's called the iPhone.
Yeah.
And it's going to get updated almost every year for the next 15 years after that. You've never seen technology adoption curves like that. It'd be hard to fathom it. And I kind of feel like that's where we are with AI right now, where there is obviously a lot of possibility with where it's going to go. Certainly a lot of risk as well that we'll talk about here in a minute. But what we're seeing here in real time is a company putting it all out there and saying, we're going to go all in on this thing and see where it pans out. Certainly there's a scenario where 6 months from now, he might say, this didn't work, and so we're changing angles again. That could happen.
It could.
But at the same time, like, I don't know, they're going to figure it out. I mean, I remember we talked about, I figured you were going to ask me something along these lines anyway, and I was trying to remember, at one point you and I on the show talked about somebody that had done a bunch of layoffs or something like that, and I couldn't remember the name, but we said something like, how in the world did this company ever have this many people anyway?
Twitter was one of them, yeah. Yeah, Twitter was definitely one of them.
Twitter, that was it. That was it. Yeah, when they canned a huge percentage of the staff.
Yeah.
And you and I sat there and we were like, well, yeah, what were those? I didn't know there were that many employees there, right? That's, I don't know, I feel like the average person listening to this right now, at some point in their career, worked at a company where you knew there were more people than necessary. You knew there were probably some people baked into the organization that, added bureaucracy, layers, didn't really add much, they were all middlemen. And now what we're seeing on this side is somebody like Klarna just, slashing and burning and trying to see if they can not only cut out that cruft, but also, see if they can rebuild with AI. The next closest sort of adoption we've seen to this is people like Sahil, the founder of Gumroad, has been tweeting more publicly about how he's been buying AI tools for his developers or for his team. I think the latest is they're using Cursor maybe, or the Claude 3.5 models to actually help their designers write initial code and to help their current junior engineers effectively, have the capability to be, higher level staff. So that's the second closest person I've seen talking about this as aggressively, where it's kind of hey, he's thinking it from the perspective of how do I use AI to augment my existing staff? And subtly what he's saying is so that I don't have to hire more. And then you got Klarna, who's just like, I'm letting everybody go. And I'm cutting these contracts, and I'm gonna try to see what I can do. I think it's a really gutsy move, and we're all seeing it play out. And I don't know if it goes really well, you're probably going to see 20, 30, 40 more well-known companies in the next 6 to 9 months probably make similar declarations. And if it doesn't go well, he'll just change course. So it's an interesting kind of bet.
Yeah, I think a couple of things. And I don't think any of this really differentiates from what you're saying, but I think, they note in the release, there are large ongoing internal initiatives that are a combination of AI, standardization, and simplification. So, when I think about this from a company standpoint, there's no question that this is a story about AI, but I think this is also a story about, company evolution. And I think, when we think about it, it happens to involve AI at this moment. But sort of like, there's a chain out there testing robots to make salads right now, in the food service industry. It's innovation in general. And I think, if we think about it here, a company like Klarna, big expenses for them really are going to be, these salesy sorts of, things, like how do they land the next big client? They obviously have some level of debt and interest expense for money that they loan out to BNPL customers, whether they do that offsite or not, if that's a separate facility, I'm not sure. But if you think about it, we're also in a world where interest rates are going to start to go down. And so, Klarna has essentially two products that they offer. The first one is get this product, over 4 payments, no cost. And, in those situations, they're either offering that for free to a merchant, or the merchant's paying some small fee to Klarna to manage that for them, and they're offering a discount to their customer, if they will, in the shape of a 100-day free interest loan. They make interest on people that finance things with them longer term, but if interest rates go down, that's either going to compress their margins, or it's going to it'll give customers other options, whether that's a 0% balance transfer or an intro offer on a credit card. I didn't realize it. We bank with Bank of America, and they have a cash back card that's a pretty lucrative card that I wanted to add. And we added that card, and I didn't realize it, but it came with 6 months of 0% APR on all purchases. And I didn't even realize it because we don't, carrying a balance isn't our thing. But I just noticed it in a box on the screen one day when I was going to pay the credit card off. So as those things start to come back, Klarna's revenue is going to get pinched. And so what the CEO is looking at is well, hey, how do I control my largest expenses? And for a company like Klarna, I would say maybe they're not 1, 2, and 3, but they're certainly in the top 10, and they're certainly near the top. It's headcount, Salesforce, Workday. Those are the 3 of the biggest expenses that are controllable. Maybe some of that stuff isn't controllable that are big expenses, server costs and things like that. So this seems to me like the evolution of the BNPL space. Klarna seems to be one of the leaders in this space, and they seem to be very viciously defending their leadership in this space by saying we're going to go out there and aggressively move to limit our largest expenses, which at this point are SaaS costs.
Yeah. Actually, not to drag this one out too much. It's a privately held company. I don't get the point of talking about this stuff publicly. What am I missing?
I think the reason to talk about it publicly is that, BNPL, you're always looking to sign the next big merchant. So you're not really a B2C company. You're not selling people credit cards. As we talked about last week on the show, there usually aren't 2 BNPL providers on a website. So if you go to LL Bean and there's a BNPL provider, it's Klarna or Affirm or whoever, but it's usually not both. So, right. If you can get, let me look at the tweet here because I have it up on the screen. So this tweet has 2.4 million views. If you can get 2.5 million people to look at one of your tweets, and maybe a couple of them are new customers, or a couple of people are thinking about leaving. This to me it's marketing. It's letting people know that you're still the top dog.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me of something when you and I were in Sioux Falls, probably whenever that was, a few months ago. Matt Paulson said something in passing. I think he was on a panel or something, and I remember him saying something in passing where he was like, he said something like, yeah, my strategy is to get on everybody else's podcast. And I was like, okay, I don't get that. And then he said something in passing where he was like, I'm thinking more about like brand search. How do I don't want a direct link. I want somebody to hear about MarketBeat and then go Google it. And so maybe that's what this is as well, is like, it's like, it doesn't directly, like, this is probably not going to have direct attribution to some new customer, but it's just one more place where somebody somewhere is going to hear about that brand name. And maybe that makes them more likely to trust hitting that little radio button at a checkout point, and going with it. So,
yeah, I mean,
we'll see how it goes.
Klarna's got a big name in this space, and I think things like this don't do anything to necessarily diminish it. To your point, like if you read the comments in the tweet, there are a bunch of people like, well, is this really true? Could he do this? Stuff like that. I mean, there's an active discussion about whether this is true or not. I tend to think it is. I mean, like, I'm not saying that you can rip out Salesforce overnight, but there are absolutely competing products out there that are more affordable. There are ways to, I mean, like you could hire your own people to do a number of the functions that Salesforce does. And at some, like, I don't know what Salesforce pricing model looks like. So at some point at enterprise scale, it may make sense to do it yourself. I mean, look, you remember the days when we had Exchange servers ourselves, and then it was like, well, Rackspace can do it cheaper. Okay, here's my server. I'm going to move it. So it goes both ways. So, I mean, I don't know which way the direction's heading now, but I mean, there's surely been arguments over time about how to effectively save money as a company when these expenses get as big as they do. I mean, you probably remember, I remember walking through, what was the name of the company? Equinix had data facilities in this area back when I worked for Aaron, American Registry for Internet Numbers back in the day. Yeah, I'm sure they do. And I remember walking through one of those data facilities near the CarMax where you and I used to work. And you had all these rows of racks of servers that were neat and clean and organized and had like the boxes all lined up and the cables all tied up. And then you got to the Google boxes and there was like, they crammed as much, pardon my French, into that box as humanly possible. And it wasn't neat and tidy, but it was like, hey, like if we're going to pay this much for this square footage, we're going to cram it. Yeah. Nobody said we couldn't stack these things on top of each other if there weren't any spots to bolt them down. So we're just going to stack them in here. Yeah. And their expense, their price per square foot was cheaper than anyone else's.
Yeah. I mean, I think even Jason Fried of Basecamp or 37 Signals has been tweeting over the last couple of months about their move from the cloud to Iron. So they're going the other way. And he's actually been releasing more and more of his finances behind it, the financial modeling behind it. And so I guess the point of this is, to what you just said earlier, there's a point for most companies, going to the cloud, whether it's for software or for infrastructure or whatever, going to the cloud is probably the cheaper way to start.
Yeah.
But once you get to a certain scale across all these things, you eventually get to that point where you can make the financial case to go the other way. And so anyway, now we're seeing it with like Salesforce and Workday, but it'll be curious to see like what these sort of generative models allow for, other expense line items as well. So I guess my summary on this is that I think that, where we are right now is that AI in 2024, whatever that broad term AI means, AI in 2024 kind of feels like the broader internet in 1999.
Yeah.
And the big question is like, will it take 4 or 5 years for it to that if you like plot out the adoption curve of the internet from 99 to like maybe 2009, the big question is like, will the AI adoption curve, however you define that, be similar, steeper, shallower? I don't know. My bet is it's going to be slightly steeper.
It feels like, as I say, it feels like it's going to be steeper, but we're definitely going to find out. Let's talk a little bit about this Axios article, and I'll say just for folks, if we run out of time, I do have one little announcement about one of our portfolio companies and a little something I'm doing with them that even Paul doesn't know about. But Paul, if you want something for free, and I know you love something for free, stay tuned to the end of the show. So this Axios article, which we'll include a link to in the show notes, talks about how companies may have more liability for AI than they realize. And it's interesting in that I'll give one example from the article because it's actually an example that I know that I have some background, some history on. It's fairly early in the article, 8-10 pages in, and it talks about the data that's being used in these models and then how you would ultimately use that data in your company. So AI is trained on enormous amounts of data, more than you and I could ever really contemplate. And so it says, for example, one study found that compared to white applicants, Black applicants were 80% more likely to be denied a mortgage loan, raising concerns of redlining and other forms of bias contained in training data. And then it links to an article from 3 or 4 years ago about bias in mortgage algorithms. And so, I mean, like the example I think they're outlining here is that, redlining, which was a practice, many decades ago that essentially prevented Black people from owning a home, whether it was by redrawing neighborhoods or preventing them from getting mortgages. Redlining was a very big part of our history. So if AI is trained on historical data that says, and I don't like the article doesn't infer what the risk is here. Are Black people more risky, or are there just less Black mortgages? Whatever it is, the article is saying, hey, look, if you're using a bucket of information and acting on that information and acting on that in an improper way based on what your generative AI tool has told you, that you may have liability for that. And I'll leave it there for you to jump in.
Well, I think this is like, this won't be a long conversation, I don't think, but this will be something that we sort of probably will be threading ourselves back to over the next couple of weeks and months and probably years, mostly because even this particular NYU article doesn't say like, hey, everything's broken. It's really just pointing out the gaps between what is the existing set of laws and some of the problems that come with AI. Example, when we think about E&O insurance, okay, well, E&O covers, humans making errors. Right. And then there's a subset of E&O insurance that you know about, which is tech E&O, right? So like, hey, if you deploy something that wasn't exactly like, it's just like that other subset of things that could happen, calculations were wrong and, all this stuff. But like, at least with the tech E&O policies that I've seen recently, most of them have exclusions and very it's very, 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 very clear that you are not to use AI or that the policy doesn't cover AI, whether it comes to to your point, whether it discriminated against somebody, whether it showed bias, whether it was just purely wrong because of some underlying data. It's not covered by the E&O policy. On top of that,
and it's also very, very broad as to what's covered and what's not covered.
Right.
Because there really hasn't been enough legislative or regulatory action to determine what that is, and B, insurance companies like wiggle room.
Well, and the thing is like, and I'm just pretending to be a lawyer here, but just kind of connecting the dots back to what we just talked about with Klarna. If you are Salesforce or Workday, the two companies that they're cutting, if you are one of those, or if you are either of those companies, existing copyright law, trademark law, all that stuff applies because humans wrote that code and it's now copyrightable and all that. Even in this particular NYU article, it mentions that the law has long held that information produced solely by computers is not eligible for protection. So in other words, whatever Klarna goes on to build, if it were to be solely built by those AI models, is it really owned? Is that IP really owned then by Klarna? The law is not clear about that yet. And so, look, the only reason I want to bring this up was actually there's two reasons I want to bring this article up. Number one, I'm going to bet you and I are going to keep coming back to this topic.
Right.
5 or 10 times a year for the next couple of years while the dust settles on the legal side. And that's because of my second point, which is, as exits happen, you know how the diligence goes when exits happen, and maybe in our world when subsequent fundraising rounds happen, the bigger that fundraising round, the more diligence it happens, and there's going to be an increasing number of questions around the use of AI and what is actually copyrightable and ownable by the company. In other words, that Series E investor or that private equity firm that wants to do a buyout is going to want to know, like, what do you actually own?
Yes.
And the use of AI is going to get a lot of scrutiny. Again, not because it's clearly defined of what's right or wrong, but rather that gray area that currently exists around copyrights, trademarks, insurance, all that stuff is not exactly clear. So this is going to be really interesting to watch over the next couple of years. So, and on a personal note, by the way, most employee handbooks right now don't clearly define the company's stance on what they're allowed to do. So in other words, if you don't explicitly say you can only use tools that we provide you to do the work, could you have an employee somewhere, for example, on your engineering team that paid for GitHub Copilot out of their pocket for $20 a month and then use that to get more efficiency? Maybe. The point is not whether that's right or wrong. The point is that when it comes to matters of diligence, exits, future fundraising, all that, that's a gap that is going to eventually get picked up by the diligence teams and could turn into a headache.
Yeah, I think this is even more prevalent in a decentralized workforce because you used to on a company corporate network you could restrict what pieces of software were running.
Yeah, you could.
So and that's not. I won't say it's unpreventable today, but it's much more difficult to prevent today than it used to be with a decentralized workforce. I think at a high level when you look at all this, I think I looked while you were talking. Remember we talked about Scarlett Johansson and the uproar about her voice being used for ChatGPT a few months ago. That was back in May, and I looked. It's recording. We're in middle of September right now, so it's been call it 3 months since that happened, and there really aren't any news updates about that story. Now, maybe there'll be a settlement, maybe there'll never be a settlement, but something's going to set some sort of standard in this space on use of voice, use of information, all that stuff. And a lot of things are going to happen in this space until that happens. And then two things are going to happen then. We're going to have a left-hand turn, when that stuff happens. And then there could be some potential unwinding. And I think we just got to wait to see what that's going to look like. Agreed.
Totally agree. All right. I am curious, by the way, about your iPhone question. I feel like as your...
No, yeah. Well, all right. So hold the iPhone question for just a second. My quick announcement.
Oh, yeah. Let's do that.
Company that we are both co-invested in, PointsPath, our friend Julian, is getting ready to launch his first paid product. They're going to have a beta product between now and the end of 2024. And it'll release a bunch of new features just to folks who are part of the beta. It's a one-time fee until he releases the monthly and annual plans next year for the product. And just for you, Paul, and also everybody else listening, Julian and I worked a deal out where I'm going to buy it for anybody who's a member of my podcast community, my Slack community for my other show, Miles to Go. So since you're a member and you've stopped by once or twice, you're now going to have access to Julian's paid beta test features here. And anybody else who is listening who wants to sign up, just find me over at Miles to Go and you can sign up as well. But it's pretty cool for him.
Your Slack group is really, really good, by the way. It's almost too good because I'm just like, the messages fly through. I'm like, I got to get some work done.
Yeah, you do. You do got to get some work done. But yeah, I think it's cool to see him roll out his first paid product and test it. And so I'm going to be interested to see by the time this episode goes live, he likely will have already launched. So be interested to see how that goes. So now for my simple iPhone question, and you kind of already answered it in pre-show, but you and I hadn't talked prior to pre-show. So my question was going to be, did you buy the new iPhone?
I did. Yeah. Full disclosure, I pre-ordered the 16 Pro.
Mm-hmm.
And look, it's probably not what I need to do, but I just have this Dana and I have this sort of long-standing policy that since we use our phones so much, we depend on them so much.
Right.
We just upgrade every year. So yeah, short answer, we both pre-ordered the 16 Pro.
Yeah, and I think it was 12 to 13, 1400, somewhere in that range.
Yeah, we did the 512 gig, whatever it is.
Yeah,
and,
I think that was 1400.
And after you trade in your device, I think it nets out to like 650 or something like that.
Oh, right, you got the trade in. Yeah, so you did trade in. Yeah, so we usually waterfall our phones down inside the company as opposed to trading in. And just, continue to upgrade other people in the company. But I've heard bits and pieces about demand slowing down for iPhones and seeing some visible indications that there does appear to be less overall demand for this model than previous ones. And so that's why I was just curious of folks that I know whether they're dropping what's a significant sum of money to upgrade. And, we think there are going to be a bunch of changes here with AI and maybe being able to build your own language model on your phone and stuff like that. And you need, maybe not need, but you probably need the faster processor to do all that. Yeah. But it's still interesting to see where we go with this.
Well, as far as I've heard, iPhone 15 Pro should support those AI features, when the software rolls out. If I had to guess, though, I think, that slowing of or the softened demand for the products I think there's two things interesting here. One is it's probably affected a little bit by the macro economy right now. I mean, dumping that sort of money on this is not easy for a lot of people, given where we are, inflation, jobs, and all that. And then the other part of it is that, this was kind of I think is like maybe one of the more recent. I mean, I can't remember the last time that something so significant in terms of their like Apple Intelligence and stuff like that is not available on the day of the hardware release.
I know.
So that slipping kind of, I would bet, played a big factor in this too, because for most people, the difference between a 15 and a 16 is negligible until that software update hits.
I agree.
I think I mentioned this to you in the pre-show and probably don't have time to talk about it today on the show, but the thing is, this particular Apple release cycle was really I think the way I said it to you in the pre-show was that in the worst case, this particular launch of stuff last week, in the worst case, was really like Apple embracing dark patterns as it relates to marketing their hardware. But in the best case, it's sort of a master class in marketing very basic upgrades to products, but making it feel like it was an entirely new product. So anyway, yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see what the actual numbers settle out to be with hardware. But yeah, we'll see. My gear comes. Did you end up pre-ordering or?
I did pre-order. I think it was, for me, this was one of the first times where I really felt like the new phone might be worth it just because I use my phone a ton like you do. So if you told me there was something I could put on my phone that wasn't Siri, but that would allow me to train on the data that I digest on a daily basis most often and help me save time.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a steep expense, $1,400 because like I said, we buy the phones and then we waterfall them down, through the company. But when you think about productivity gains, I mean, if that could save me 5 minutes a day, it pays for itself over the course of a year. So it'll be interesting to see. I'm still skeptical that the value will be there. Like you said, like we're not even getting the new software with the hardware, but remains to be seen. I still think I'm trying to think how many releases you'd have to go back to have something that's this potentially exciting about a new iPhone. Like better cameras, faster processor don't really do a lot for me. It's really, battery life is probably the biggest one. And so this one gets extended battery life, which is great. And then potentially, some sort of, small language model on my phone with just my data. So those two things are appealing. And that's why I hit the button.
I think for me, it's like the camera on a personal note, with my kids being, the ages they are, the camera is an easy sell. And then the other side of it is that, and I agree with you also on the other side, like if it gives me two more minutes of productivity a day, that's worth it. Yeah. But I think the more interesting part here on a professional note or whatever you call that is that, let's not forget that Apple has this deep access into the average consumer, no, I shouldn't say average, but the consumer's pocket with their gear.
Yeah.
And, when they rolled out things like Ask App Not to Track, it had huge implications for everybody else. And nobody really, I don't think very many people understood that when it rolled out. Yeah. On the flip side, that's kind of like where I'm at with Apple Intelligence. It's not going to be the best, for the technical nerds. But at the same time, Apple is probably in the best position to figure out how to consumerize AI and make it good. So it's hard to bet against Apple when it comes to something like that. And so anyway, we'll see when the gear arrives, like what it's like. But, I know we're not going to talk about running out of time today, but what is also interesting to me is like, just before we recorded this, it looks like the Apple Watch or the latest versions of the Apple Watch, including last year's model, are now approved by the FDA for sleep apnea detection. It looks like the AirPod Pros 2, last year's model, is now FDA approved or very close to FDA approval for a hearing aid. So it's interesting that like their other wearable devices are now entering the medical world. It's going to open up the ability to pay for some of those things, I think, via HSA and FSA accounts. So that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I mean, I don't know. It'd just be interesting to see how it plays out. So yeah, I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, interesting on the FSA, HSA part. Anyway, we'll we'll pin it there, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that. And I have a feeling we're going to be talking a little bit more about Klarna, too. God knows we're going to be talking about AI.
Absolutely. Sounds like we've got a Sioux Falls trip in the works, you and I and Julian, and we'll put a date out on that soon. And then, I didn't tell you this, but possibly a Des Moines trip in December. I'll ping you about.
You know, there's no time better to go to Des Moines than December.
I know.
Just like going to Sioux Falls in January. We need to look at a calendar, my man. There are warmer times to go to some of these places.
There are warmer times, yeah. Well, you know, I didn't claim to be the smartest guy in the world. I always tell people my default answer is yes. So I might have said yes to some things before I checked the calendar and the temperatures.
Fair.
All right, man. Any fun travels for you this week?
I'm going to help you in the future. I'm going to send you a map in a different month, show you what's blue and what's red and all that stuff, just to help you with this sort of stuff.
Yeah, I probably should just get a map on the wall or something.
I like that.
Part of my set dressing that Jeremiah gave me.
There you go. Yeah. So yeah, I've got a Vegas trip before this drops. Then I'll be home. I'm down to see our daughter down at college at Virginia Tech. God, Sioux Falls, Orlando, Vegas again, Austin. And then if all goes well, Web Summit, Lisbon in November. So yeah, I've got a pretty busy 6-7 weeks.
Oh, my anxiety level just rose listening to all those destinations.
Mine's already elevated thinking about all that travel.